I've got my top 4 GOAT format decks from fall 2024. These are the most interesting and most competitive deck lists that shook up the GOAT format meta over the last 3 months. Welcome to GOAT Duels. Now let's get started with what I think is the most exciting development to the GOAT format meta in some time. This deck is what I call Last Will combo. People have been theory crafting this deck for a while, but it's finally starting to get those big finishes. Yes, I know that I could have covered the version that had the triple Stein, triple Horus, which did get first, but I decided to cover this because this is sort of the more typical list. The idea here, and anyone who's watched my channel, I'm always talking about how broken Stein is. Why aren't people playing Stein? What the hell is going on? Yes, this deck is playing one copy of Stein. But, of course, Cyber-Stein has a downside. It costs 5,000 life points. And sometimes you don't have 5,000 life points. So Stein is this card that is incredibly strong in certain situations, but very bad in other situations. So when you have a card like that, you typically want it to be searchable, right? It is situational. I'm going to search it out when it's good. I'm not going to search it out when it's bad. And you've got Sangan to search out Stein. That is pretty typical, but in addition to Sangan, we also have these 3 Last Wills, which, I'll be honest, these Last Wills are very versatile. You look at this deck list, we have tons of good targets here. We've got Injection Fairy Lily being the other obvious one. Hey, I want a Last Will for big damage, but I don't quite have 5,000. I'll get Injection Fairy Lily instead of Cyber-Stein. We also have Visor Shock. I actually don't think you need to play Visor Shock in a deck like this, but the idea is that we've got big synergy with Last Will. You can either search it out from your deck with Last Will, or you can tribute summon it, trigger your Last Will, trigger Visor Shock, bounce all your opponent's cards back to their hand, and then resolve Last Will, get Stein, kill them. You'll notice we've also got Amazoness Archer and Cannon Soldier. Some of these cards in the deck, it's I think they can be changed around a bit. I don't think we need both of these. One card, though, that I want to talk about as being very key is Exiled Force. Exiled Force is, of course, a good card in GOAT format generally, but it's nice with Last Will because kind of like Visor Shock, we can either search it out with Last Will or use it to trigger Last Will. With Exiled Force, though, we're mainly using it to trigger Last Will, which is why, I'll be honest, I would really like to see the second copy of Reinforcement of the Army here. Really. Because we've got, in this particular list, we've got 3 warriors. I think, believe it or not, even with 2 warriors, just Exiled Force and 1 other warrior, I would still play the second copy of Reinforcement just because of how strong Exiled Force is in this strategy and the fact that you basically want to see Exiled Force all the time. So, we've also got some cards here that help push through damage. We got Jinzo, for example. We can tribute for Jinzo, resolve our Last Will, go get a Cyber-Stein, attack while the traps are negated. We've got Magician of Faith here, lots of spells to get back. Not too surprising. What I would like to see, though, is I'll be honest, I would kind of also like to see BLS splashed in here somehow. I would like to have maybe a couple of other lights. Maybe a Zaborg, a DD Warrior Lady, the second copy of Reinforcement of the Army, something like that, because Blackluster Soldier, it's great in these OTK style decks. We've seen Stein Monarch decks that have played BLS in the past. I think we could go for something like that here. What I also want to talk about, though, is the GOATs meta. That is a key piece of what this deck is doing. Scapegoat, it's kind of wild. When GOAT format started, people thought Scapegoat was this control card. But in modern GOAT format, Scapegoat is almost played in combo decks more than control decks, which is, it's kind of crazy. Because what's so great about Scapegoat in a deck like this is that you can use Scapegoat to block damage, preserve your life, make sure that you stay in Stein range, but then also it's okay, I'm going to go off, I can, meta my Scapegoat into Thousand Eyes, take a monster, maybe tribute the Thousand Eyes for Jinzo or Visor Shock, do something. In this deck here, we also have Cannon Soldier and Amazoness Archer for Scapegoat. So it's we can use Scapegoat to block damage, or we can use Scapegoat to deal damage. Incredibly versatile card. Also, we got the GOATs United We Stand combo. United We Stand, just another way to push through more damage. This deck is just a pile of damage. That's really all it is. I also want to shout out Enemy Controller. Now, note with Metamorphosis, we can use Metamorphosis to trigger Last Will, but it doesn't work if we're tributing a GOAT token. So we could do something like meta our random level 4, like meta our Zumbira the Dark into a Dark Flare Dragon, and then resolve our Last Will, go grab whatever we want. Enemy Controller is the same basically, but Enemy Controller, it kind of has these versatile applications where we can like change our opponent's GOAT to attack mode, you know, depending on what monster we steal with it. That monster might be some really broken card, like Blackluster Soldier. So the one Brain, one Econ is interesting. I think Econ in this deck is arguably better than Brain, but I think 1 and 1 is fine. Like, everything else here is, you know, fairly standard as far as spells goes. Like, we're really all in on the OTK, which is why we have 3 True Nades and a Heavy. I think you could take this deck into, like, the more controlling direction and maybe, like, not play as many Giant True Nades, but then again, like, kind of play some more card advantage-based cards, you know, utility cards like Blackluster Soldier, maybe the second Magician of Faith, etc. But I think this direction is fine. Ceasefire is another card that, like, I think is fine, but, like, you don't have to play. I also, in this tournament, it's like, I don't know what the rule sets for all of these tournaments are, so it's possible that, like, maybe there was time. That could also explain, like, the Barrel Behind the Door in the side deck. If the time limits on the rounds were, like, 60 minutes, then having the Ceasefire in the main makes sense. Having these Barrel Behind the Doors in the side kind of also makes sense. But, you know, if not, maybe not. Deck Devastation Virus, that's like another card that I don't really feel like we need it. Like, yes, it can kind of like randomly win you games, but it just seems like very, very inconsistent. Like, yes, you can use it on Zumbira. That's obviously why we've got Zumbira in the deck. You can technically use it on Jinzo. If you tribute set a Jinzo, you can then deck Devi your Jinzo. Some of these Cyber-Stein targets you can also deck Devi. Like, you can get a Gatling Dragon. I believe that's a Dark, and then you can, like, deck Devi that. But, like, I don't know. To me, this just seems really, really situational. I would probably, like, cut the Zumbira in the deck Devi. But overall, like, this strategy is really nice. We also have, like, some Last Will targets in the side deck. I really like the Panda in the side deck as a Last Will target for the Scapegoat matchups. I really think you can get a lot of value out of that. And again, we got like all these like weird burn cards, like Secret Barrel, Barrel Behind the Door. I don't know what that's about exactly. Level Limit Area B, I'm also not sure if I'm a fan of. I would actually think I would rather play Gravity Bind, like if we had to pick one or the other, just because for the fact that one, Gravity Bind can be used to surprise your opponent, right? Like when you activate Level Limit, your opponent knows you have it. Whereas Gravity Bind, you're flipping it after they've already entered their battle phase. And also because of the fact that we can tribute summon Jinzo and then negate our own Gravity Bind and go for game, whereas we can't do that with Level Limit. But that's like a minor nitpick. Overall, I really, really like this deck. I think this archetype has potential. There are a lot of Stein archetypes that have potential. But what we see is like Stein is kind of going in the direction that Return went, where it's like, hey, we have this card that can randomly kill our opponent, but like our game plan isn't reliant on that. It's not like, oh, we have to Stein. If we fall below 5,000, we just can't win. It's sort of this mess of various sources of damage, and we, you know, kind of hope the cards come together in the right order. You know, we might be killing them with United We Stand or Lily or whatever, but this way of building decks where it's sort of like a combo deck that can win a fair game of Yu-Gi-Oh! These decks tend to do well in GO format. Second, believe it or not, I kind of wanted to highlight another Cyber-Stein deck. This isn't really a Cyber-Stein deck, but I wanted to give an example of like a more mainstream deck that can kind of splash Stein. This one here is by Kitsuko. I believe it's from the same tournament, but for the most part, this is like a pretty normal warrior deck, right? Like you look at like 36 of the cards and they're all pretty normal, but then it's like, oh, by the way, we've got a Last Will and we've got a Stein. And in this deck, it's like, this is even more of like a fair game plan. It's like, yes, sometimes we will just Last Will for Stein and kill our opponent, but often we're gonna like Rhoda for Exile, Last Will, use Exile to pop their monster, and then use Last Will to search like a Don's Lug or a Spirit Reaper. Also very good. If your opponent has like 2 monsters, you can Exile to pop 1, Last Will, get Mystic Swordsman level 2, attack the face down, whatever it may be. We've also got Zaborg. We all know how good Zaborg is in GOAT format. Very good against the Chaos decks due to the stats, the effect, the attribute. But here, we can also use Zaborg to trigger our Last Will. Now, in this deck, like you might think, oh, it's really hard to trigger Last Will because we only have Exiled and Zaborg. But you have to keep in mind, we have 2 reinforcement of the army to search Exiled, and we have Premature Burial and Call of Haunted to get the Exiled back. So it's actually not super, super hard to trigger the Exile. Also, in like a worst case scenario, you can use Tribe's effect to kill itself and trigger your Last Will that way. But this is basically just a mainstream warrior deck with the tech Last Will and Stein. So I wanted to show off this list here so you can get a sense of, oh, like Stein's good. You can fit it into a lot of different strategies. I also will say, I kind of like the Morphing Jar. Like some warrior decks, they'll main deck like 1 Magician of Faith, and I think of as like a 1 of flip effect monster, I would rather have 1 Morphing Jar than 1 Magician of Faith, right? That's just my opinion personally. People don't play around it very much. Like, you know, we talked about Morphing Jar being underrated in our 69 most underrated GOAT format cards video. Morphing Jar was on the list. And yeah, I do like it in a warrior strategy. I think you could also side it as well. Speaking of the side, this side is like a little weird. We've got kind of like the Kotetsu equip package, which I like. I mean, Kotetsu is a cool card. We've got like Azura Big Bang Shot. So, you know, I think here like a big part of this side is like, hey, I know that GOAT control is going to be a tough matchup, so I want some stuff to deal with that. So we've got the Azura Big Bang Shot combo to hopefully cheese them. And we've also got like 1 Giant True Nade in the main deck. I like that too. You know, it goes with your Big Bang Shot. You can Big Bang Shot a monster, Giant True Nade, and then get rid of the monster. And it's also very good in Warrior Mirrors because often what happens in these Warrior Mirrors is that you both just have like a ton of back row set, and a big part of who wins comes down to like how the players use their Solemn Judgments. And when you True Nade in the Warrior Mirror, often it like forces them to use their Solemn Judgment. It's kind of like a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like if you True Nade and they Solemn, you're super happy. But if you True Nade and they don't Solemn, you might just kill them, right? Like it might just be like, oh, Stein kill you. So yeah, the 1 of True Nade is nice. We have seen that before in some warrior decks, but it goes with the Stein in the main, and then it goes to the Azura Big Bang Shot in the side as well. And then I guess like for the aggro mirrors, we can also bring in like Goat Swap. That's kind of an interesting idea. Overall, you know, Kitsko is definitely experimenting with a lot of newer, untested ideas, but it seemed to work for him. And Warriors, I think people have been a little more pessimistic about Warriors lately, but I definitely think they're still a top tier deck, definitely a deck that has potential to take down tournaments. And I do think that we will be seeing decks like this doing well in tournaments in the future. I also wanted to highlight this Earth Aggro from Jace. This was first place in an Obelisk tournament. And Earth Aggro, like, I'm not going to lie, I think it's kind of like a lower tier deck. For a while, like, Earth Aggro was really popular. It was like, in some tournaments, it was like the 3rd or 4th most popular deck, but we haven't really been seeing it win that much. And that's because a lot of the cards are just underpowered. Deity Assailant is not a very powerful card. Goblin Attack Force, it's a little hit or miss. Sometimes it can be strong. Other times it's just kind of crappy. Kaiku, again, a little hit or miss. Like in some matchups, it's great. Others, not so much. Gigante's strong card. That's the main reason you're playing the deck. I did decide to feature this list, though, just because if you are going to play Earth Aggro, I think you probably want something very, very close to this list. Like, you could change a couple of cards around. Do you need the 3rd Dust Tornado? Maybe not. Do you need all 3 Dust Shoots? Maybe not. Do you maybe want, like, a 2nd Smashing Ground? Yeah, it's possible. But, like, the 1 of Final Attack Orders, I think, is very, very good. Even it's like, you know, we see some lists too where like you could play Giant Rat, and Giant Rat like kind of has mild synergy with Final Attack Orders, where like if the rat attacks into a set Dekochi, you get to trigger your rat off the Final Attack Orders. But like Rat, it's kind of like you can take it or leave it. It's definitely not like a card that you have to play by any means. And yeah, I mean, overall, like I don't have a lot to say about this deck, but this is just kind of like no nonsense. We're not really playing cards like Gravekeeper Spy that can be a little gimmicky. We're not playing cards like Giant Rat, which, again, can also be kind of situational and not as good against strong opponents. Overall, it's like, yeah, I think you might want the second Smashing Ground, only because, like, sometimes this deck has trouble dealing with monsters that have more than 2,300 stats. So, like, if you're up against, like, a BLS, it can be hard to deal with. Even if there's just, like, a Zaborg or a Jinzo in play, it can be hard to deal with. So, like, one Smashing might not be enough. But overall, like, everything in this list is, like, pretty standard. And that's why I'm featuring it, because, if you are going to play a deck like this, I think you do want to have all of the good cards and none of the bad cards. That means play the final attack orders. Don't play, like, probably the Rats and the Gravekeeper Spies, because, those cards, we don't really know if they're going to be good in every matchup. Side is also standard-ish. If you play this deck, you definitely have to side 3 King Tiger Wangus. People do still play Scapegoat, and it is exactly what we want against Scapegoat. Of course, Final Attack Orders deals with goats as well, but we only have one of those. And yeah, we got, like, Kinetic Soldier for warrior decks, and, we can banish it to summon Gigantes. We got Amazonas Archer, that's an Earth where it's like we can get rid of Ojama tokens and whatnot. Compulsory Evacuation Device. I'm not sure what matchup this is for other than Goat Control. The problem with putting in this against Goat Control is the fact that Goat Control decks are going to side in Decree against you, and you don't want to be siding into a bunch of traps. So if this is mainly for Goat Control, I think you could cut the Compulses and just have more Book of Moons, because it kind of does the same thing but gets under Decree. We can even Book of Moon our own guy, like DD Assailant. You can even do tricks where, like, you Book of Moon your Goblin attack force when your opponent, say maybe they try to Sakuretsu armor it, and then they attack into your set Goblin, and you can just flip final attack orders. Overall, this is a solid version of this deck. I don't think it's the best deck. I don't even think it's the best aggro deck, but it is a good deck. You can win with it, so give it a try. Lastly, I wanted to cover a Chaos Control deck. This particular list is by Geisty, one of the greatest to ever do it in GOAT format. This list got top 4 in Worlds, and I think kind of one of the narratives from Worlds that a lot of people are sleeping on is that Chaos Control had, like, a pretty good run. I believe there were, like, 2 Chaos Control decks in the top 8, which people weren't expecting. Geisty did really well with this list. I think one other player did very well. The name is escaping me right now. But we've talked about Chaos Control previously on this channel. I did mention it as a deck that was a good choice for 2024, only because it's sort of the Chaos deck that does better against the decks that people typically use to counter Chaos. So what does that mean? Well, we actually talked about some of them in this video, right? Like Stein decks. Hey, we've got 3 Scapegoats to stop us from getting Stein OTK'd. Warriors. We've got cards like Creature Swap Meta, to deal with all these warrior monsters, Blade Knights, Donzalugs, etc. Again, I've talked about this before. This list here, it is pretty much kind of your normal-ish Chaos deck. The monster count's a little low, but we've got Spies, we've got Takochis, we've got Faiths. This is like your standard Chaos deck, except, oh, guess what? We've also got 3 Goats and 2 Metas. You'll notice here, it's like the trap lineup, I think, can be changed. I think it really depends on the meta. Solemn is like, it can be good against some decks, but not others. It can be really good in control mirrors in particular. If you're expecting heavy trap lineups, the list that I had on my channel had Decrees. You can go with that as well. Azura is also kind of an interesting choice. I feel like it's really been a while since we've seen main deck Azura in a high-level GOAT format tournament like World. So I don't know if, like, this was some sort of meta call, like he knew that other players were playing Chaos Control as well, because this is by far, like, one of the best monsters in Chaos Control mirrors, because it attacks for 17, kills all their goats. If they meta into Thousand Eyes, it's like, okay, the Azura bounces to your hand. Here, it's like we've got some synergies too, where you can use it with creature swaps. I don't think you have to main 2 swaps. Like, I think you can main 1 side 1. I think you can main 0 side 2. It kind of depends on, like, what you want to make room for. Here, for example, we only have 2 Spies. We only have 1 Dakochi. We only have, like, 1 Tsukiyomi. So, play around with this list. Change it up a bit. Everything in the main deck, like, you can't really take a card here and go like, oh, this card's bad, you shouldn't play this. But a lot of things are optional, like even the Dust Shoot. you don't have to main one Dust Shoot. I know some people will take a list like this and add Upstart Goblins. You all know I'm not really a fan of Upstart Goblin. I'm even less of a fan now that people are running Stein and giving your opponent 1,000 life points if they're on a Stein deck or an Injection Fairy Lily deck. That is not what you want to be doing. Side is also fairly standard. I'm pretty amazed. We've even got the second Azura in the side. Geisty was just like, yup, one Azura in the main, not good enough. I need a second in the side. Everything else is like pretty standardish though, right? Like we got the Sacris for the aggro decks, we got the Walks and the Mobius for the burn decks. We got Zombira for the aggro deck as well, and then we got like Azura for mirrors. You've got Karibo for the Stein combo type decks. So yeah, I think this is a very good list. And again, I think like people in every tournament I've noticed, I mean, this goes back like years and years. People always focus on what got first. They go like, oh, this deck got first. That's the deck that we should be talking about. Whereas often like it's not the deck that got first that is like the most interesting or even like the best deck moving forward for future tournaments. Sometimes it's like the deck that got second or the deck that got third, or, maybe there were like 3 decks in the top 8 that were all the same, but like, they got unlucky and didn't make the finals or whatever. So yeah, I think you should try something like this. I mean, yes, I know this deck is like a little inconsistent. Like you can just open things like, oh, I opened both my spies, or I opened like double Solemn, or, I opened multiple Thunder Dragons, or I've got like 2 metas and no goats, or I've got 2 goats and no metas. Like, yeah, I get that. But like this deck has a lot of power, and it's really like one of the few decks that's consistently done well in GOAT format over years and years and years, right? There are not a lot of decks that can say like, oh yeah, this deck has just always done well at GOAT format Worlds, other than basically this deck and Standard Chaos. If you guys do want to see our analysis of the first place Chaos deck from Worlds, it's right here. So if you haven't seen that video yet, go watch it now.